PR Connections Radio presents.
Welcome to Vegas Hockey Hub here on PRConnectionsRadio.com, the voice of new media. I'm your host, Ian Rachiele. And on this episode of Vegas Hockey Hub, I have Ringmaster Sal from the Sports Circus. And on this episode, we're going to be breaking down and talking about the Chicago Blackhawks. And we did yesterday's show where we kind of broke down the Buffalo Sabres, but in a similar way, we're going to talk about the Chicago Blackhawks as well. And Ringmaster Sal, first time on the show. How's it going, my friend?
Everything's great. Thanks for having me on.
And when it comes to Chicago Blackhawks, now very recently, there was the jersey retirement of Chris Chelios, ironically enough, right behind you, against you, right on the back of your shoulder. But when it comes to Chris Chelios, his jersey being retired by the Blackhawks, now just very quickly, tell us about jersey retirement, like what was going on in that situation there.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. And out of all the years of being born and raised in Chicago, it is a very, very cool place to watch a hockey game. Now, folks, if you don't know, if you've never been to the old Madhouse on Madison Street, the old Chicago Stadium, it was clearly the loudest building in the entire league. As a matter of fact, when Chris Chelios came into the league back in the 1980s, he came into the league being a Chicago boy, playing for the Montreal Canadiens. And the Blackhawks were rising. They were getting better and better and better. And so they took a champion from the Canadiens and said, you know what? We want that guy on our club. We want him on our club. As a matter of fact, he won a Stanley Cup against the LA Kings and Wayne Gretzky back in the late 1980s. And so the Hawks said, we want to bring the hometown boy back. And they brought him back, and the Hawks were really on the rise. They had a young Jeremy Roenick. Of course, Jeremy was always one of those guys. You want to be around Jeremy, right? But more importantly, they needed somebody that was an offensive-minded defenseman, but at the same time that could deliver the big hits and also be a stay-at-home defenseman. He was one of those weird guys that could really do it all. And if you look back in hockey, there are a few defensemen that could really do that. Chris Chelios happened to be one of those guys. And it pains me to talk about number 7 because for me, watching him play in Chicago, being a local guy, whatever, and then, in my opinion, selling his soul to the Detroit Red Wings, who he absolutely hated, despised, whatever, said, okay, I'm going to go play over there. As a matter of fact, they got so bad in the city when Chelios went to Detroit that he had a chili place called Chili's Chili right down the street from the United Center, which took over the building for the home, of course, for the Blackhawks after they bulldozed the Chicago Stadium. But he had to close his restaurant because nobody would go there. It was completely boycotted. I don't even know where we were going with this, but I'm just kind of rambling here, so stop me anytime.
But when it comes to Chris Chelios, of course, the game that they did was against the Detroit Red Wings. And Detroit Red Wings, Chicago Blackhawks, the bitter rivalry that it has been forever. But as someone who knows very much about the Chicago Blackhawks, explain to everyone, for people who don't know, how the rivalry is for Chicago, how much there's a disdain for the Detroit Red Wings.
So you see, folks, you may have heard that a couple of times if you watched the game, which was the retirement game for Chris Chelios. The entire stadium outside of the handful of Detroit fans, they shout this. The players do. It's just one of those hatred things. But there's a little bit of history behind these two teams, and it goes way back. Now, you think of the ownership. Let's go back to the 1960s for a moment, right? Let's go to 1967 specifically. The owner of the Chicago Blackhawks and the owner of the Detroit Red Wings, they're brother-in-laws. And it happens that they were also real estate investors together. And so they had this piece of property, and it was this arena, it's an older arena, whatever, and it was just an asset. Well, it happened that, look, these are friendly guys, of course, because they're family, even though they own rival hockey teams. And this goes historic Original Six stuff, right back to the 1920s. But here's an interesting thing, and I'm telling you this for a reason. Although the fan bases don't like one another, the players typically don't like the teams that they're playing against. It happened that these two owners owned this building called the Checker Dome down in St. Louis. They said, you know what? We don't know what to do with this building, as a real estate investment. Why don't we put a hockey team down in St. Louis? And we'll call them the Blues, right? Because what do? They have a lot of blues and stuff down there. And it was the St. Louis Blues that are a product of the Chicago Blackhawks ownership and the Detroit Red Wings ownership. How do you like that for some good trivia? And so back then, although the fan bases could not stand one another, just like today, this goes way back decades and decades and decades. The reality is the teams still don't like each other. And even when you go to a game at the United Center today, all the way back to the Chicago Stadium, the fans, you would hear this, Detroit, this thing. You would hear that because what would happen is the ownership from the Detroit Red Wings, they would send busloads and busloads, maybe 5,000 fans to come down to Chicago. And the Blackhawks ownership, Bill Wirtz, at that time would make it available for those tickets to go to the Wings fans. So the fights were on the seats. The fights were on the ice. It was just chaos everywhere. It didn't really matter. End of day, these fan bases could not stand one another. And that is kind of what you're looking for, I believe.
And that is exactly what we're looking for. You're talking about the Chicago Blackhawks here on Vegas Hockey Hub. I'm your host, Ian Rachiele. We're here with Ringmaster Sal from the Sports Circus. And, going with the Chicago Blackhawks and kind of going back to that time period with the 90s, because like Chris Chelios had his jersey being retired, there were some great players back in the day in those 90s teams with Chicago Blackhawks. He did mention Jeremy Roenick earlier in the show, but how incredible Jeremy Roenick was. I mean, some people do remember him being in San Jose later in his career, Arizona later in his career, but him being in Chicago, man, he was just an outstanding player back in the day. Tell people what you remember about Jeremy Roenick. I mean, he was just incredible.
Jeremy Roenick was one of those guys that if you look at today's game and you say, what is Jeremy Roenick in today's game for the people that don't know that era of hockey from the 1990s, for example? The player that Jeremy Roenick is in today's game is Alex Ovechkin. Very rough, physical kind of game, a grindy game, very amazing skills with the hands. I mean, this guy, very soft hands, but can deliver a hit. But also, he was a great two-way forward. I mean, the guy just played both ends of the ice incredibly. But also, you think of the other guys on that team from Captain Dirk Graham and old number 33. He was one of those grindy, gritty guys, kind of remind you of Drew Doughty in today's game, right? And back to those defensemen. The Blackhawks had some great ones like Steve Smith and Brian Marchment. Look, this was a rock-solid team with some great players that just played the game in a grindy, gritty way where they would literally bully their way into a win, kind of like the old Philadelphia Flyers from the 70s, the Broad Street Bullies.
Philadelphia was definitely a team that was all about being tough and gritty and rough and stuff like that. The Chicago Blackhawks were that way as well. But something that doesn't really get mentioned a lot, which really I think should be mentioned more, was the goaltending. Because they had two iconic goaltenders at one time in Ed Belfour and Dominic Hasek. But eventually they had to let one of them go. And then there was a situation with finances. We're not going to go there. But when it comes to Dominic Hasek and it comes to Ed Belfour, I mean, when it comes to both of those guys, in your opinion, who was the better of the two?
The Dominator. Because Eddie Belfour, he was a great goalie, but he also had a nickname around the league as Five-Hole Eddie.
Five-Hole Eddie. There you go. And, when it comes to Chicago Blackhawks, I really look at what they had back in the day. And they had a really good coach as well in Daryl Sutter, who eventually won a Stanley Cup somewhere else way later down the line. Some people might remember who that team was. Some may not. But when it comes to Daryl Sutter, this was a coach who really knew how to win and bring out the best in his players. But what was the reason for that? The reason why he brought so much out of his players?
Well, part of it, when you think of Daryl and his brothers, Brent, Brent played for the Blackhawks, Daryl played for the Blackhawks. I mean, there's a whole bunch of Sutter brothers. But it happened that they were, first of all, and I could tell you this from my former NHL correspondent for the Sports Circus. By the way, check us out at thesportscircus.com. A shameless plug, of course, for the Sports Circus, if you don't mind. But the reality is, Sutter brothers were grindy, gritty. They're not skilled players. They would tough you out of 60 minutes. And so even when Daryl was playing, you say, he wasn't a great player, but he was a good soldier. And that's how the Sutter brothers were. They weren't impact players, but they were very dependable players. And they expected a lot out of their players. And so you have to think of before Sutter brother. And we think of a guy by the name of Mike Keenan. And Mike Keenan was the one that brought the Hawks to the Stanley Cup Finals against Super Mario and the Pittsburgh Penguins. Of course, he had Jaromir Jagr at that point. But you think of Mike Keenan, and you say, all right, how could they go from Keenan to Sutter and have an issue with the team? Well, they really didn't, because Mike Keenan was that guy you'd love to hate him. But he was very, very good of coaching the team, and Sutter was not a player's coach either. Neither of those guys were players' coaches. And this is what happened in L.A. with Sutter brother. And the reason after 2 cups they got rid of Sutter brother is because he wasn't a player's coach. Now, I heard that from one of his players who's a friend of mine today. He wore number 46 for the Chicago Blackhawks, and that was Colin Frazier. So Colin won 1 ring with the Blackhawks, 1 cup there, and 2 with the Kings. But I even heard it from him. He just wasn't a player's coach. And so Sutter brother, although he was good, in today's time, guys like that, they don't stick around because the players get paid too much money. It's always about what? Show me the money! Right?
It's always about the money. Yeah.
It's always about the money, and it really wrecks the game today. So there's your analysis on Sutter brother, a very good coach, but often a misunderstood coach too.
And, since we're kind of going to be talking about coaches, this is way later down the line, kind of getting into the modern era of the Chicago Blackhawks. But they had Coach Q. And Coach Q, when they went on that dynasty run in the 2010s, he was a coach that a lot of people looked at. And, we saw what he did beforehand with the Colorado Avalanche before getting to the Chicago Blackhawks, and then what he did later with the Florida Panthers. But when it came to Coach Q, similar to Sutter, when it comes to Coach Q, how did he do with the Chicago Blackhawks in terms of being around the players, in terms of making that team what it was? And that was a dynasty in the 2010s.
Well, an interesting thing about Joel Quenneville is that he is a lot like, I would say, a guy by the name of Bruce Boudreau, even though their personalities are very different. Now, I have a friend in common with both of those guys, and I heard it firsthand from somebody that's known her for 40, 50 years. It happens that you take a guy like Joel Quenneville, who is a player's coach. Bruce Boudreau, very much a player's coach. The players loved these guys. And there was some things that happened in the Blackhawks organization with the video guy, whatever, that really kind of blew up Joel Quenneville. In the same way Joe Paterno got blown up at Penn State. Very much the same situation, right? But you take a guy like Joel Quenneville, you say he did a really good job. But here's the one thing that a lot of people seem to miss in the whole building of a team and maintaining of the team. And I'll go back to the Chicago Bulls back in the early or mid 1980s. Well, you got to remember, the guy who built Chicago Bulls was who? Jerry Krause. The guy that built the Chicago Blackhawks was Dale Talon. And Dale Talon is the unsung hero with the Blackhawks in the same way that Jerry Krause was for the Chicago Bulls. And he is the guy responsible for building these dynasties and negotiating the great contracts. But when you think about Joel Quenneville, he kept the people glued together in the same way that Phil Jackson kept the Bulls glued together. But the Bills weren't built on the court by Phil Jackson. They were built by Doug Collins. So Doug Collins, you got to remember, he equals somebody else, right? Whereas Joe Quenneville is to somebody else, right? So you've got to realize the finished product would be Quenneville, and the finished product in basketball, of course, was Phil Jackson. So you have to make sure that the parallels are right, because it's easy to say, well, Phil Jackson was a great coach. Well, Joel Quenneville was a great coach. Well, yeah, they kept the teams glued together, but they weren't the guys that built them.
Well, I mean, it's similar to that point when you talked about, Doug Collins and Phil Jackson. I mean, the coach before Joel Quenneville was Dennis Savard, and he was there for a couple of years as their coach. Legendary Chicago Blackhawk. I mean, Dennis Savard is loved when it comes to the Chicago Blackhawks organization. But I will say, when it comes to Chicago Blackhawks organization, you mentioned Dale Talon earlier on. And with the Florida Panthers, eventually moved on and did that. But when it came to Chicago, it feels like he doesn't get enough respect, or he doesn't get enough acknowledgement for how he built that team and how it went from the mid-2000s, where they were kind of here at the bottom, and then took some pieces, made some trades, made some acquisitions, and then brought them back to the top. And I'll say about Dale Talon, I have the utmost respect for. But when it came to the Blackhawks organization, of course, you had the two franchise players. You had Jonathan Toews and you had Patrick Kane. But what made those two the franchise players? What was about them in terms of playing hockey that just made them stand out as Chicago Blackhawks?
Well, I think a lot of people seem to miss this one because really, at the end of the day, it came back down to how secure were they playing in the offensive zone without having to worry about backpedaling and playing or back checking, because you had Keith and Seabrook back there. Now, keep in mind, with Keith and Seabrook, they were there before Toews and Kane were there. Also, good old number 4 that I'm wearing right here. Hjalmarsson was in the system at that time too. So the Blackhawks built that team on defense, which made those guys comfortable up front. They knew they wouldn't have to go running back or skating back at light speed to try to back check everybody, because they were safe and secure with stay-at-home defensemen.
Duncan Keith, Brent Seabrook, and, Duncan Keith, I do wonder when eventually, he formally retires, and, stuff like that. When it comes to Duncan Keith, will he also join the 9 people that are in the rafters at United Center? Will that eventually come one day?
No question. He was one of those guys that he was great on both sides of the puck, and he could bump off just about anybody with the puck. Doesn't matter what their skill level was. He was one of those guys. And I would argue he was leaps and bounds better than Brent Seabrook. And Seabrook was a good one.
Brent Seabrook was a good one. In fact, I think he is still getting paid somewhere in the NHL. I couldn't tell you what team it is, but he's still on someone's payroll as of this current moment. But with Duncan Keith, this guy was a great defenseman, was considered actually one of the best defensemen for a couple of years in the NHL. But they also had some good defensemen on that organization as well. You had Brian Campbell, who they brought over. You had Johnny Oduya. Like, there was some really solid defensemen that were on the Blackhawks team in the 2010s. But the forwards was something that I did want to mention, because they had this forward who just recently went to the Hockey Hall of Fame in Marian Hossa. And Marian Hossa was an incredible signing for them when they brought him over. But for Marian Hossa, how big of a deal was that to bring a guy like that and put him on the top 6 in Chicago?
Well, the interesting part about Marian Hossa was, you have to remember, go back from his first year with the Hawks, go back 2 seasons. So the first of the 2 seasons, so basically it'd be the 3rd year back, he ended up losing the Cup Finals to the Pittsburgh Penguins with the Detroit Red Wings, if I'm not mistaken. Then the year after that, he ended up he had dealt to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and then he lost the Cup Finals that year. So it was losing the Cup, then he goes to the Hawks and winning the Cup against Philadelphia, which was kind of cool. But what Marian did was, Marian was a bull on the puck. He was arguably one of the greatest two-way players I've ever seen. And the only comparison, there's actually 2 comparisons that I have for Marian Hossa when I mean being bumped off the puck. One of those guys was Mario Lemieux. You just couldn't bump him off the puck. It was almost impossible to get him off the puck. And then I would also argue that Mark Messier was another one of those guys. You just couldn't bump him off the puck. Not big guys. I mean, Lemieux was a big guy. Messier was not that big of a guy. But his game would probably be more parallel to Mark Messier's. But Marian Hossa filled a gap in this team with all the Stanley Cup playoff bumps and bruises, right? He knows what it's like to get there, but to lose. But more importantly, bringing the young guys to a position like, that's the piece we needed. And that's really the hole that Marian Hossa filled.
And with Marian Hossa, it was unfortunate what happened to him at the end of his career. Unfortunately, he had the incident with Rafi Torres. That kind of limited his career prematurely. But when it comes to the Chicago Blackhawks, and we're kind of get to the current Blackhawks in a minute, but continuing with the dynasty that they had in the 2010s, where would you rank that in terms of the all-time dynasties in the NHL, because obviously we had the Oilers, we had the Islanders, we had the Flyers. There's so many great dynasties in NHL history. But when you look back at the Blackhawks dynasty in the 2010s, I mean, what would you really rank that in terms of dynasties?
I would say that they were probably the equivalent of the 90s Detroit Red Wings. They certainly weren't as good as the Isles. They certainly weren't as good as the Canadiens of the 60s. I mean, probably arguably was the best of the best. And of course, here's a bit of trivia. That 60s team, who did they have at the helm of that organization? Scotty Bowman. Who did Detroit have? Scotty Bowman. Who did the Blackhawks have? Scotty Bowman. The common denominator, the guy with 20 rings or whatever the hell it is, it's Scotty Bowman, right? So you go back to the leadership there. But the Blackhawks are probably a touch better than the Detroit Red Wings of the 1990s. Maybe not too much better, because I mean they had a deep team and they had 4 guys on the blue line, really, that you can depend on. And really what it takes to win a cup these days is you got to have 4 blue liners. You really do, because they got to eat the minutes up. You don't need 5 or 6. And you go back to the 2015 Blackhawks, they had 4 guys, and they all had a lot of minutes. But more importantly, all of those dynasties in common had what? Great defenders.
And before we segue over to the current Blackhawks, I did want to ask you this question. When you say that you need at least 4 blue liners to win a Stanley Cup, is there any team in the NHL right here, right now, that you would say, all right, they have 4 solid blue liners and they can win a cup right here, right now?
No. I can't come up with a team with 4. I really can't. I can come up with maybe 3. And of course, I go right to Colorado as a team that is rock solid. And there's no reason that they should not win a Stanley Cup this year. But I don't believe that when you look up and down who's doing what in the league today, I don't see a lot of good defense played.
I mean, the defense is actually being missed. I mean, as somebody who's a defensive-minded person, I love defensive-minded hockey games. It's something that is severely being missed in the NHL. I don't need to see 8 to 7 hockey games, every single night. I don't need that.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we are getting into the current Chicago Blackhawks, as we're talking about this on Vegas Hockey Hub, I'm your host, Ian Rachiele. We're here with Ringmaster Sal from the Sports Circus. And, they do have this superstar who they drafted first overall, their franchise face right now, and that is Connor Bedard. And the way that he's playing in Chicago and the way that people are just looking at him and watching him play, is he someone that you think could be a top 10 player in the NHL someday, or is that just too soon right now?
Well, the problem is he's got no one to play with. And that's really what it comes down to. You look at every great player that's done great stuff in the league, from Gretzky to Messier to Lemieux to Guy Lafleur. I mean, all these great players in the past and present, they all have somebody along with them. That's what you got to look at. When the Blackhawks put somebody right next to him, then all the heat will be taken off of him. But in the meantime, it's kind of like you think of, great receivers in football. You could double team them, you could triple team them, whatever the hell it is, right? Look at Michael Jordan, always drew a double, always. But they always left somebody else open. So when Connor Bedard gets somebody that can play alongside him and skate alongside him, then the Blackhawks are ready to take a move up to the next level. Right now, they're the worst team in hockey because they've got nobody. When the Bulls got Michael Jordan, that's all they had was Michael Jordan. He came out in the 1984-85 season. That's it. So it took a while. Then they brought in Charles Oakley, right? So they had a big body in there. And then Scottie Pippen from Central Arkansas. And then on and on we go. The point is Connor Bedard doesn't have any of that.
So if you were the Chicago Blackhawks general manager, let's just say that you're in his shoes right here, right now. Connor Bedard, he does need people. Are you planning on building through the draft? Are you planning on going to free agency, maybe trying to sign some players in the future? Like, what would you do if you were having on that suit and tie and you were the Blackhawks GM right now?
Well, I need speed next to him. I've got to have at least one more speed guy. And here, let's think about this. Look at the Edmonton Oilers. Outside of Connor McJesus and Leon Draisaitl, they really don't have a lot. Just being honest, right? And their Achilles has been what? The goaltending and then the defense, right? You could take a great goaltender and put mediocre defense in front of them. Now you've taken that great goaltender and brought him down to being a mediocre goaltender. Same thing. If you have a mediocre goalie and you have great defense, now you got a great goalie. So the Blackhawks need to shore up the blue line And they've got a bunch of big kids on this team. Make no mistake. The Blackhawks are trying to do what they did back in the 2008 season, thereabouts, when they were starting to build that defense. And then, of course, they draft Kane and Taves, et cetera, right? But they're trying to get those kids some experience. And I remember I was going to those games when Keith and Seabrook were young. And I would scream at Seabrook all the time. Why? Because he backpedaled all the time. You can't backpedal on defense. You get burnt left, right, and center. So will the Hawks put somebody next to Bedard? Yes, they will. But you've got to have good defense.
And with the young guys that are on the Blackhawks organization, Lucas Reichel, he's somebody who's a young up-and-coming guy, Chicago Blackhawks organization. But it just seems like their prospect pool isn't living up to par right now. If you're the Blackhawks, would you try to make some trades, try to strengthen up their farm system, or would you try to go out and get veterans to help out with Bedard?
Well, you need somebody. That's why they brought in Corey Perry that disappeared, whatever, right? And so you've got Tyler Johnson that's still there, and that's good. He's got a lot of cup experience. But the problem is you've got no real speed guy, and you may have heard some dialogue between Connor Bedard and Foligno, right? And so the problem is he knows that nobody else can keep up with him on this team. I mean, look at Colorado. Cale Makar is arguably the best player on that team, right? One of the best players in the league. And where does he play? He's on the back end, right? So he's almost like a Paul Coffey from back in the day with Wayne Gretzky. So if the Blackhawks can find some speed and skill along with filling a hole on the back end, now they've got something there. So I think they're going to draft somebody, but they're going to go out and try to make a deal to say, all right, this kid now has had a year under his belt. We need some speed with him. And at the end of the day, we're going to try to build our team through some free agency because we've loaded up through the draft. I think that you're going to see the Hawks in the next couple of years, not this year. I think they're going to be sellers, of course, at the deadline because they're going to try to get a player or two so they can use those as pawns for the next level.
And you know what? I'm really interested to see what Chicago Blackhawks do in the future. There's going to be a lot of good transactions and moves that are going to need to be made. But since we have about 2 minutes left in the show, I just want to very quickly talk about this. It was announced recently that the Chicago Blackhawks, for the 5th time in franchise history, will be in the Winter Classic. And it's going to be held at Wrigley Field in Chicago. And just very quickly, since they're going to be taking on the St. Louis Blues, no rivalry there, how does it feel as a Blackhawks fan to see them at the Winter Classic once again, considering back in 2009, you had the Red Wings and Blackhawks game that was iconic, one of the first ever Classics that was ever done. So
yeah, it was fun going to the game. I had a lot of fun with it, and it didn't turn out our way, of course. But it was fun going to that stadium. I grew up going to that stadium as a kid. I've been in there hundreds of times. But to see a hockey game there, it was pretty exciting. It really was. And to see the Hawks play there again, I mean, it's an iconic field. It is what it is. And so I think it'll be great for the fans. I think it'll be great for the National Hockey League. And you can bet that the Blackhawks will put some other players around Bedard to make sure that it's not a 7-0 game. So we don't have, the Cardinals beating the Cubs, 7-0, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, well, hopefully it's going to be the Cubs beating the Cardinals 7-0, by the time the MLB season goes around. But I digress. So now that we have about 90 seconds left, I just want you to tell everyone where they can find you, since you are the Sports Circus.
Thank you. Well, of course, folks, you can catch me Monday through Friday on Pick Your Favorite CBS, NBC, and Fox Sports affiliate or independent, or across 213 radio stations across the country. Also carrying on Cox, Comcast, Spectrum, Frontier, Time Warner, and Wild Cable Television and Hotel TV in all Nielsen rated markets, over 210 of them. So you can find us everywhere. Also on social media, you can find us at Instagram at TSC Show. On X, you can find us at The Sports Circus. And of course on Facebook, you can find us The Sports Circus. Better yet, just Sports and Circus as well. Make sure you like, subscribe, and follow.
Absolutely. And with Vegas Hockey Hub, go on all social medias and follow us there as well at Vegas Hockey Hub, and follow your host at Ian J. Rachiele. And until next time, I'm your host, Ian Rachiele. Thanks to Ringmaster Sal from the Sports Circus for being on the show. And continue watching hockey. Go support junior hockey, and go Knights, go.
PR Connections Radio thanks you for watching this podcast. Check out more episodes of this show and our others at prconnectionsradio.com.